On August 14, 1945, World War II was nearing its end, and the Japanese Empire was in ruins. The cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been razed to the ground by U.S. atomic bombs, their troops were completely demoralized, and none of the army's top brass had any illusions. The Japanese hierarchs knew that there was no choice but to declare defeat and capitulate. However, one day before the official surrender, the commander of the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police, ordered the destruction of a series of vital documents. By burning those papers, the main evidence of one of the biggest war crimes of the war was lost for decades. These were the records of thousands of women kidnapped by the Imperial Army and forced to become sexual slaves in the service of soldiers. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we'll tell you all about the vast network of sexual slavery set up by Japanese troops in World War II. To understand this story, we must go back to medieval Japan. In feudal times, the chiefs of the Japanese armies had a disturbing tradition, which consisted of forcing the conquered villages to choose a group of women to serve as professional prostitutes subjected to the invading troops. The military authorities justified this aberrational act by claiming that, by having previously organized sex workers, the soldiers would not rape the rest of the female population. This military practice became a custom, surviving the test of time until the 20th century and with it the Sino-Japanese War and World War II. It was in this context that the enslavement of women took new forms, and the number of victims rose to unsuspected levels. In 1937, during the occupation of China, the Imperial Japanese Army captured the capital city of Nanjing, where it massacred civilians. Over the course of 6 weeks, hundreds of thousands of people were murdered in cold blood, and the fury of the victorious troops was also displayed through the mass rape of Chinese women. The Imperial High Command sought to calm the situation by bringing sex workers from Japan and establishing official brothels with the aim of making the men leave the female population of Nanjing alone. This was a failure and the sexual violence stayed the same. For this reason, the Japanese hierarchs decided to legalize what was already happening, and authorized the kidnapping of women to be converted into slaves, forced to satisfy the troops against their will. The Japanese term for sex slaves was ianfu, which meant comfort women, a euphemism that masked the dire situation they found themselves in. Although most of the victims were captured in China, the same practice was replicated in all the territories occupied by the imperial military forces. In Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia, every time a rural village was conquered and massacred, the surviving young women were taken from their homes. On other occasions, in order not to attract attention, the soldiers resorted to deception, promising the female population that, if they accompanied them, they would get them well-paid jobs in restaurants or factories. Once they accepted, they were arrested and reduced to servitude. We have the testimony of Yasuji Kaneko, a Japanese soldier whose memories are chilling. The women screamed, but we didn't care if they lived or died. We were the emperor's soldiers. Whether in military brothels or in the villages, we raped without hesitation. The comfort women were housed in establishments called comfort houses. These were actually brothels where they were imprisoned, lived in deplorable conditions, and were systematically raped by officers and common soldiers. Brothels operated in all sorts of places, from seedy slums to luxury hotels, nightclubs, and even airports. Those in charge of running the brothels were, in general, hierarchs of the Imperial Army, although in many cases they were left in the hands of Western businessmen, whose lack of scruples made them see this as a highly profitable business. A typical day for slaves began in the morning, when they were awakened and forced to prepare to attend to the troops. They had to comply with a workday of at least 8 hours, in which they were subject to the wishes of the Japanese troops. Although the authorities had regulated the service, establishing that they had to have moments of rest, these orders were often ignored by the heads of the brothels. In the same day, a slave could be forced to have meetings with up to 80 different men, who were also authorized to beat or torture them. Japanese soldiers even received manuals explaining the best way to choose a prostitute, so that they could avoid contracting any sexually transmitted disease. On the other hand, it is important to note that the enslaved women were not only Asian, but also European women who for different reasons lived in the countries occupied by the Japanese army suffered the same fate. Blonde, blue-eyed girls were especially coveted by soldiers, which is why Dutch women living in Indonesia were one of their main targets. Lee Ocasian is a Korean woman who was kidnapped at the age of 15 and reduced to servitude. In her testimony, she recounted the experience of living in comfort houses as follows: "It was like a slaughterhouse, but not for animals, but for humans. Horrible things were done there. They said they were going to kill me. They beat and kicked me constantly. They went so far as to brandish a knife near me and say that they would finish me off." On several occasions, Lee Ocasian wanted to escape from that hell, but her attempts were in vain. She was always caught and subjected to brutal beatings, to the point where she was rendered sterile and lost her hearing, as well as her teeth. The vast majority of surviving slaves became infertile as a result of psychological trauma or physical assault. Some were forcibly sterilized, while others, if they became pregnant, were injected with the chemical 606, an abortion-inducing drug. In August 1945, one day before they officially surrendered, the Japanese authorities ordered the destruction of all documentation related to the comfort women, to erase the evidence of their crimes. This is why the exact number of victims is not known and, although estimates vary, specialists maintain that at least 20,000 women were enslaved. Other calculations, on the other hand, are around the total of 400,000 victims, although the exact number is still the subject of debate. Most of the sex slaves died during World War II, either because of their terrible living conditions or because they were killed by soldiers. On the other hand, it is known that survivors had to deal with post-traumatic stress, and the lack of professional help led many of them to commit suicide. At the end of the war, dozens of women testified about what happened, and the Japanese government had no choice but to hold a trial. However, only 11 officers were found guilty. One of them was sentenced to death, while the others were sentenced to prison. In the decades that followed, the Japanese authorities downplayed their military sexual slavery network and even questioned its existence, claiming it was nothing more than unfounded slander. In 2007, the government offered an official apology for its crimes for the first time, and agreed compensation for the victims. What do you think was the proper punishment for those responsible for enslaving women? Leave your answer in the comment box below and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.